Imagine the quiet creak of floorboards beneath slippered feet, the soft rasp of parchment being folded, and the fading warmth of a tea kettle no longer steaming. Outside, the Potomac darkens to pink, and the wind stirs the curtains with a breath barely heard. If this is your first visit, or if you've returned to rest your thoughts once more in the stillness of history, you're in good company. Here, we tell stories slowly. Here we leave behind the clamor of modern life and trade it for the soft rhythm of another era, or the ticking of a clock. We will wander the corridors and imagine what he saw: polished banisters, handmade rugs, a beloved dog asleep near the hearth. We'll venture into memory and into mystery. We'll hear the quiet strength in letters he never sent. This is something smaller, quieter, and perhaps more real. This is the George Washington who lived in the in-between between public and private, between power and retirement, between myth and man. It is in those hours after sundown that he revealed himself, not in grand gestures. Let your breath slow to the rhythm of another time. The hour is late, the house is still, and history like sleep is drawing near. We begin now, with the hush of twilight at Mount Vernon. But in small ones, the folding of a waistcoat, the smoothing of a blanket, the dipping of a quill. These are the details we explore tonight, not to awaken awe, but to offer perspective, not to glorify, but to humanize. We'll all reflect on the aching contradictions of a man who fought for liberty while overseeing enslaved laborers. You may find that Washington's evenings, quiet and intentional, are not so far from your own. You may recognize the need for peace, the pull of reflection, and the burden of thoughts too large to share. This is history as a whisper, not a shout. A candle, not a spotlight. And through that lens, we find truths that often escape louder stories. We'll all walk gently through the spaces where history meets silence, those spaces where we must imagine what he felt, because he chose not to write it down. Not everything about Washington was carved in stone. We'll open the journals he wrote in with such deliberation. We'll peek into the library, where books on ancient Rome sat beside practical manuals on farming and architecture. And later, we will follow him to the privacy of his bedchamber, where toothaches throbbed quietly beneath a calm exterior, and where the burdens of leadership sometimes pressed more heavily than any uniform he wore. The rustle of paper and the distant sound of hooves on dirt roads become the soundtrack of a different world. These stories are meant not to awaken the mind, but to calm it. They do not demand attention, they offer it gently. And if your eyes grow heavy along the way, that is not only welcome, it is the point. Within Mount Vernon, the grand but modest home of America's first president, the day has ended not with the blast of trumpets or the rush of affairs of state, but with the slow hush of ritual and evening like many others, in a life few truly knew. George Washington's quiet evenings, the man behind the myth, is not a tale of revolution, though it comes from a revolutionary life. It is not filled with battles, though the man at its heart knew many. Instead, this is a slow unspooling of the hours after sundown in the life of a man who carried the weight of a new nation, yet often craved nothing more than a fire well tended, a letter well written, and a moment of stillness. This is not the George Washington of marble statues and rousing speeches. This is not the general on horseback, nor the austere face on a dollar bill. This is the man behind closed doors. The man in his nightshirt, stirring honey into strong black tea. The man who ran his fingers over weathered pages by candlelight, who bore aches that never made it into the history books. And tonight, you are invited to walk gently through the twilight hours of that man's world. Welcome, once again, to Echo, and to another gentle journey through time in our History for Sleep series. Tonight's story is one of dignity, privacy, and quiet fortitude. We begin in the softening light of early evening, when the last chores are being completed at Mount Vernon, and the great house begins to still. But our story will not remain within those rooms alone. This is not the tale you read in school books. It is not the condensed summary of a career, nor a celebration of flawless greatness. As you settle in, perhaps beneath a familiar blanket, or with a warm drink nearby, allow the past to draw near, not in drama or urgency, but in the comfort of familiarity. So close your eyes if you wish, or simply listen. The day begins its gentle retreat at Mount Vernon, long before the sun disappears behind the trees. There is a hush that rolls in softly across the wide lawns and down the quiet paths leading toward the Potomac. What was silver at midday now turns to slate, smooth and unmoving in the evening calm. In the downstairs kitchen, the heat of the day's cooking has lessened. The hearth still glows, but the pots have been cleaned, the ash raked, and the last of the bread cooled on linen. He walks in the garden at dusk sometimes, when the weather is kind and the aches in his joints less demanding. But tonight, he has returned a bit earlier. There is a weight in his posture, not from sorrow, but from years. It was designed with care, expanded over time, and maintained with an eye toward balance. The entryway is wide, paneled in wood. The light from the high windows has begun to fade, casting long shadows that stretch like fingers across the stone floors. Another sleeps in the corridor, head resting on the cool floor, breathing slow and even. It flickers on an inkwell, on the smooth spine of a leather-bound ledger, on the silver loop of a letter opener, placed just so. The stars begin their patient emergence. First, one or two above the treetops, then dozens, then more, until the sky above Mount Vernon sparkles faintly. But soon, even those will quiet. The night belongs to rest, and the estate knows this. Its buildings settle. The wind hums gently through the shutters. The great trees sway in rhythm with time. There is only routine, and in that routine, peace. Not the man in marble, not the father of a nation, not the stern leader of armies or government, but simply a man. A man who walked his home at twilight, who paused to feel the warmth of the fire, who watched the stars return to their places. A man who, like all others, sought rest at day's end. There is no city nearby to obscure them. The darkness here is honest. It humbles and comforts in equal measure. A final candle will be lit upstairs, and in time, another will be extinguished. One by one, the lights of Mount Vernon will go out, to remind us that even the greatest figures in our shared past longed for stillness, for home, for the familiar creak of floorboards in a house they loved. And that, perhaps, is where their true story begins. Not abruptly, but gently, like leaves settling after a breeze. The world of the day is past. The world of dreams awaits. Papers are stacked neatly. Some are correspondence, others records of estate, business, planting rotations, inventory, orders from Alexandria. The pen Washington will use tonight lies already uncapped, waiting. He prefers to write in the evenings, when interruptions cease, and the mind, like the house, grows still. They know this hour well. There is no more activity to chase, no more guests to sniff at curiously. The house is theirs now, in the way only dogs can claim space silently, loyally, without demand. Paintings of landscapes hang on the walls, English countryside, noble horses, hunting scenes, all arranged with symmetry. The smell of beeswax polish lingers faintly in the air. He is no longer the soldier of winter campaigns, nor the lean commander in uniform. Upstairs, a servant trims a candle before placing it on the table beside the master's favorite chair. A book rests in his lap, something he's read before, perhaps more than once. He is not reading for discovery, but for familiarity, for the rhythm of sentences already known, the comfort of ideas already explored. The words are less important than the silence they bring. His eyes move slowly across the page, and once in a while, he lifts his gaze to the flames, lost for a moment in thought. The chair is worn in just the right places, its armrests smooth from long use, the cushion softened by years of quiet sitting. It faces the hearth, where embers glow behind the iron grate. The fire will be kept modest tonight, just enough to warm the room and light the corners. Washington dislikes waste, even in comfort. He is older now, broad-shouldered still, but slower, and in some ways, softer. His steps are careful, deliberate. A cane, if used, is carried more for habit than need. The path from the gardens to the back door is familiar beneath his feet, the gravel smooth, the scent of boxwood sharp in the air. One of the household cooks folds a cloth and places it over a final dish to be served simple fare, meant not for a feast, but for a familiar evening. In this house, his silence is not discomfort, but presence. A nod here, a glance there, communicates all that is needed. The staff moves around him not with fear, but with well-practiced respect. He is not a man of outbursts. He is a man of form and precision. In that quiet, he climbs the few steps to the inner hall, the warmth of the house enveloping him as he crosses the threshold. A servant extinguishes one of the wall lanterns, her hand practiced, her motions reverent. She knows this rhythm as well as the walls do. A heron glides low over the surface before vanishing into the reed beds. Doors open and close with care. Linen sleeves brush against polished banisters as hands glide along the wood for balance in the descending light. The great staircase, waxed smooth by decades of footsteps, carries only a whisper of movement as the household settles into its evening form. The wind that lifts from the river barely stirs the neat rows of cherry trees. The grass, damp with a lingering touch of spring, holds the day's warmth. And the memory of many footfalls, some heavy, some light, all now fading into the past as night creeps in. The air, still warm from the waning afternoon, carries the scent of turned soil and distant chimney smoke. Somewhere far off, a horse whickers low and soft, answered only by the rhythmic creak of leather harness as one of the grooms walks him back to the stable, his footsteps muffled by the gravel underfoot. It is a time of transition, not sudden, not loud, but inevitable. The pace of everything slows by degrees, like a great breath being exhaled across the estate. It is twilight. From the broad porch of the mansion, one could see the water begin to darken. Within the house, a different quiet begins. It is not the silence of absence, but the hush of completion. Elsewhere, the hallways echo softly with the swish of long skirts and the muffled tap of leather soles. George Washington, by this hour, has already left the outer grounds. He does not speak as he enters, and no one expects him to. Mount Vernon is large, but not grand in the way of palaces. As evening takes hold, the household bends toward stillness. The dogs have settled themselves already. One lies near the base of the fireplace, paws tucked beneath, eyes half-lidded. In the study, a candle is lit. The flame dances gently, casting light across the surface of the desk. Outside the study window, night has fallen fully. The sky, once tinged with pink and lavender, is now deep blue and soon black. From the back veranda, one might hear a final distant sound, a gate closing, or perhaps the quiet murmur of voices from the quarters farther down the property. George Washington sits by the fire now. There is nothing urgent in this hour. As the night deepens, a servant will come again to check the windows, to draw the curtains, to lay out the soft slippers and nightshirt. And in this soft transition, from light to shadow, from movement to stillness, we find a different George Washington. Here, in the hush of Mount Vernon's evening, history draws close, not to awaken, but to comfort. There is something sacred in the making of evening tea, something quiet, deliberate, and gently restorative. For George Washington, this ritual was not one of ceremony, but of rhythm. His teeth, or what remained of them, were a quiet torment. Their absence and the crude contraptions that filled their place a source of both discomfort and quiet endurance. And so, warmth was not just comfort, but necessity. He did not sip with haste, each movement lifting the cup, breathing in the steam, Setting it back on its saucer was slow, considered. But beneath his measured words, something always lingered. A hint of fatigue, a moment of self-questioning, a fragment of reflection. The ink, a rich black made from iron gall, held fast to the fibers of the page. Then came the record of temperature, wind, and sky. Clear and warm, he might write. Or cloudy, wind from the east. These were not details to be skipped. The weather shaped the rhythm of plantation life, dictated the labor of the fields, the health of the horses, the moods of men. In this, as in command, he was deliberate. His was not a mind that leapt, but one that built layer by layer, brick by brick. Even in the quiet hours, he worked. After the sky came the estate, who had visited, what letters had arrived, what was planted, who was ill. The sound was deep and slow, echoing faintly through the rooms of the great house. The journal shut with a soft click of its cover, and Washington simply sat. He did not fidget. He did not speak. His eyes remained on the fire, the shifting light playing across his face. The stiffness of age was met not with complaint, but with acceptance. The candle on the table was lifted, and its light cast a small circle that moved gently with him as he turned toward the stairs, just as they had been the night before, just as they would be the night after. And in that stillness, one might see not the general, not the president, but the boy from Virginia, grown into a man who had seen the world, led a revolution, shaped a government, and who now, in this moment, wished only for quiet. The room, now empty, seemed to close itself softly, as if exhaling after holding in its warmth for one final hour. He did not look up when it rang. He knew the hour. It lived in his body. The same way a soldier feels the rhythm of a march, or a farmer feels the season in the air. It was nearly time to retire, for listening to the wind move across the fields, for feeling the ache in old bones, and the solace of solitude. Washington had spent so many years in service, in action, in expectation. But here, by the hearth, he was allowed, if only briefly, to let that all fall away. No advisors, no clamor, just flame, paper, tea, and time. And then, just sometimes a line or two that reached deeper. His eyesight, not perfect, strained in low light, yet he persisted. There were volumes he returned to Marcus Aurelius, whose stoic meditations likely mirrored his own temperament. Addison's essays, farming treatises, even though he knew their contents by heart. Books, like friends, did not always need to surprise to comfort. Their presence alone was enough. It smelled faintly acidic, but that too was part of the ritual. He would dip and pause, letting his thoughts catch up with his hand. And in that pause, one could almost imagine the room breathing with him. Sometimes it sat forgotten, the focus drifting instead to the weight of the journal in his lap, or to a letter that he reread by lamplight. The fire now burned low, the last tea cooling, the dogs long asleep. The house held its breath, waiting. These letters came from all over the northern states, former soldiers, political allies, strangers who felt they knew him, distant relatives. They asked for opinions, endorsements, reassurances. And more often than not, he would respond, carefully, with kindness where possible, with caution always. The candle flickering slightly, the dogs shifting in their sleep, the fire letting out a muted crackle as a log settled inward. There were nights when the entries were short, merely the weather, perhaps the condition of his crops, a note on the movement of goods between farms. And then, occasionally, more a meditation on service, on mortality, on the burden of being looked to by a nation that knew him more as a symbol than as a man. On another, he noted a dream not in detail, but merely that it had disturbed him enough to wake before dawn. These moments, rare as they were, offered small openings into his private world. Not loud confessions, but soft murmurs, like someone speaking from another room, barely loud enough to hear. There was no need to rush anymore. Not in this room. Not in this hour. The kettle would have already been placed near the embers well before the hour arrived, the copper warming slowly as the flames licked against the hearthstone. There was no rush. The fire understood its role. The coals did not shout with heat. They glowed patiently, exhaling waves of warmth into the room where shadows gathered, softening the corners and edges of carved furniture. Outside, the last glimmers of dusk had faded, but inside, the flame was steady, the space wrapped in a low amber hush. Washington's preferred tea was black and strong, often with a spoonful of honey if the ache in his mouth persisted. The chair he used near the hearth was always the same. It sat with quiet authority beside the small table where a lamp burned low and steady. The leather of its seat was worn smooth, the wood polished by the trace of many nights. Cup in hand, staring for a while into the fire before reaching for his journal. It was always there, its leather cover softening with the oils of his fingertips, the pages thick and slightly coarse, ready to receive the weight of a day's thought. He wrote not in flourishes, but in clarity. His hand, trained by decades of correspondence and command, moved with calm precision. There was no need for grand prose. The strength was in the quiet record itself. The room itself, lined with books and trimmed in dark walnut paneling, was not ostentatious. It spoke of discipline, not grandeur. The shelves were filled not with trophies of conquest, but with volumes of philosophy, agriculture, history, and stoic reflection. Titles from the ancient world, from Rome and Greece, sat beside works on surveying, etiquette, and the practicalities of estate management. These were not decorations. They were companions. On this particular evening, Washington would have sat. He did not always record his feelings directly. Washington was a man of restraint, in ink as in voice. The pen he used was one of several, always clean, always ready. He often began with the date, underlined with a simple stroke. One evening, he wrote of walking the garden path alone, and the way the damp air reminded him of early mornings in New Jersey during the war. His tea, once warm, now cooled beside him. He did not always drink it to the bottom. He never rushed these replies. Each word was chosen, tested in the mind before placed on the page. But not every evening was for letters. Some were for stillness. He rarely read aloud, but he did read often. In the far hall, a clock chimed. 9 bells, maybe 10. But still, he sat for a while longer. The pen was returned to its place, the ink well closed, his breath steady, his hands folded, his mind not racing, but drifting. Eventually, he stood, not with effort, but with care. Behind him, the fire flickered once more, then settled. The journal remained on the desk. And outside, the stars continued their patient watch, unchanged by titles, unbothered by history. Just as they had been the night before, just as they would be the night after. It is quieter, yes, but not empty. In its silence, it breathes the quiet labor of hands that have long known rhythm over noise. This is the domain not of generals or founding fathers, but of those who move through corridors half lit, who tie aprons by habit, not for Washington, whose tea is already taken, but for the staff who tend to the winding down of the evening. A broom whisked quietly across the floor near the rear hall. The moonlight touches the leaves with a faint shimmer, pale silver on soft green. A few plants are clipped carefully, brought inside to dry or press. These small acts, done by candle or moon, are as much a part of Mount Vernon's rhythm as the grand letters penned in the study. Her needlework, always nearby, rests in a small basket. The lamp he carries casts a reflection onto the glass, superimposing his face onto the darkness, as if to remind him of his place between worlds. He latches the bolt gently. The house is sealed for the night. She does not often stay up late, but she is not without her own rituals. She may have penned a note to one of the grandchildren, or reviewed the household inventories, or read a passage from her own favored text. Her life has been a shared rhythm with her husband, separate in some parts, deeply entwined in others. And though history often forgets the depth of her contributions, here, in the fabric of this home, her touch is everywhere. Invisible to most, but necessary. Always necessary. A hinge that sighs as it closes. The clink of iron as a pot is hung up for the night. A final check of the shutters. It is the kind of calm that doesn't shout its value, but rather offers it like a folded cloth, quiet, clean, and full of care. The estate, so full of hands by day, becomes a place of hushed communion by night. The great wheels stop turning, and in their pause, there is room to breathe. The people who remain awake do not rush to finish, nor drag their feet. They move as if guided by a larger rhythm, one laid down by generations, kept alive not through memory, but through motion. The extinguishing of a sconce. And then, after each sound, a greater stillness follows, like ripples after a stone disappears beneath the surface. The very walls have been steeped in this rhythm for decades. They have learned when to hold breath, when to sigh, and when to sleep. The stone sinks are now empty, the water drained and wiped clean. The air smells faintly of damp linen, soot, and the ghost of lye soap. A long bar of wax is returned to its shelf, and the room is darkened, one lantern left swinging gently by the door. Its flame dances, not to be seen, but to be remembered by the one who will return at dawn. A cup of strong root decoction, sipped slowly between tasks. Not indulgence, just comfort. The kind that comes not from luxury, but from tradition. A recognition passed down from those who knew that even laborers must have their rituals, their pauses, their private moments within the great machinery of a household, and who speak in glances and gestures so subtle they barely ripple the air. This is the still room, a space of jars and linens, of mortar and pestle, of dried herbs in muted colors and soft crumbling textures. It is at this hour, not bustling, but not yet asleep. The linens in the guest chambers are smoothed one last time. A faint scent of lye and dried air lingers in the fabric, clean and cool. The covers are turned back just so, the pillows plumped gently, the basin checked and left with fresh water, should it be needed. These are rooms that may or may not be used tonight, but they are prepared nonetheless. Because routine is not about efficiency, it is about order, about harmony, about making the space ready, even if no one walks through the door. There are things to finish before true rest can come. In the soft cocoon of nightfall, far from the flicker of the hearth and the creak of Washington's writing desk, there exists another world within Mount Vernon. Its wooden tables are lined with careful order, nothing ornamental, only useful. Jars with labels, handwritten in delicate script, twine and wax seals, folds of cheesecloth and neatly stacked muslin bags. The scent that fills this room is unlike any other in the house. Lavender, rosemary, vinegar, beeswax, faint smoke, and the ghost of past preparations. It is a room of memory, in a way of last season's preserves, of old remedies, of moments bottled and stored with patience. The still room sits at the rear of the estate, modest in size, but filled with gentle purpose. Tonight, a lamp hangs low from a hook near the shelf. Its glow is golden, soft, and kind. It illuminates the hands of a woman folding a square of linen with a practiced ease. She is neither hurried nor idle. Her movements are guided not by urgency, but by habit, and that habit is built on years. Her eyes do not flick from task to task. They move slowly, anchoring each motion in its own time. She prepares a small cloth bundle, perhaps an herbal poultice or a sachet, to place near a pillow upstairs. It will carry a hint of chamomile and dried mint, to ease the restlessness of joints, or perhaps simply to calm the mind. In another corner of the house, a low fire is kept alive, not to warm a room, but to steep a brew. The domestic calm of Mount Vernon at night is not total silence. It is a soft murmur of final gestures. Beyond the still room, in the garden close to the house, a final figure may linger, someone seeing to a row of plants before the full weight of night presses in. Above stairs, the rooms begin to settle into their own peace. And in the laundry beyond the main house, the day's final embers glow under the brick chimney. Martha Washington, if she is still awake, may be seated quietly in her own quarters. In the back hall, a servant glances once more through the narrow window pane to the blackness beyond. This domestic calm is not born of wealth alone. It is born of ritual, of patience, of invisible, endless motion. There is, at this hour, a rare stillness to Mount Vernon's inner workings, and the house, too, seems to know. Its beams do not creak loudly. Its floors seem to absorb sound. The very walls have been steeped in this rhythm for decades. They have learned when to hold breath, when to sigh, and when to sleep. The constellations that look down on the same soil, long before the house stood there, continue their silent gaze. They know this rhythm. They have watched it through wars, through storms, through years of drought and of harvest. And they will watch it again tomorrow. Outside the still room, the stars deepen in their clarity. Mount Vernon, for all its many rooms and countless stories, folds itself inward for the night. The air shifts. Not colder, not heavier, just softer. The mattress, firm and linen-covered, is turned back neatly. His silhouette is long, unmoving for a moment, as he gazes into what remains of the fire. Perhaps he is not thinking of anything in particular. Or perhaps his thoughts are many, crowding the space between candlelight and sleep. The great decisions of his life are long behind him, yet memory often keeps its own hours. Some evenings he recalls military maps and frost-bitten marshes. Other nights, it is the faces of men, those lost, those loyal, those forgotten. But on most nights, it is simply the rhythm of the estate that fills his mind. The planting, the letters, the health of the animals, the weather's turn. In the quiet glow of firelight, the great man becomes gently small. And in this room, that is allowed. A warming pan may have been passed between the sheets earlier, spreading residual heat that still clings to the fabric. He is capable still, and perhaps he prefers to be alone in this final hour. His waistcoat is removed and laid over a nearby chair. Then his shirt, carefully unbuttoned, its fabric faintly stiff from starch, but softened at the collar from wear. His nightshirt is pulled over his frame, a cotton draping loosely over shoulders and chest, carrying the faint scent of lye soap and cedarwood from the drawer in which it was stored. The feather pillows, though not excessive, offer support shaped by years of consistent use. Nearby, a small table holds a glass of water and a candlestick, its flame tilting slightly with the air of the room, steady but alive. As if the estate, like the people within it, recognizes that the day is no longer required to carry its own weight. Now comes the surrender to darkness, the long, slow retreat from wakefulness. Upstairs, behind the thick doors of the private chamber, George Washington prepares to retire, not as president, not as general, not as legend, but simply as a man ending another day. One more cloth folded. The door is closed, not latched, and the corridor accepts the weight of that decision with grace. For now, though, the still room grows darker. The lamp is lifted once more. One more jar is returned to the shelf. It is the stillness of care completed, of hands that have done what they could, as well as they could, and know that, for tonight, it is enough. Its symmetry is comforting, its palette calm wooden beams above, plastered walls washed in pale hues that catch the final shimmer of lamplight. The windows, now shuttered against the breeze that sighs in from the Potomac, bear the faint perfume of distant pine and dew-covered earth. The sounds from outside have vanished almost entirely, leaving only the occasional creak of timber, or the muffled bark of a dog settling into dreams far below. The calm that fills Mount Vernon now is not the stillness of nothingness. At last, the house begins to exhale fully. All the small rituals, the tea, the fire, the closing of shutters, the folding of cloths, have reached their quiet conclusion. The room is neither austere nor ornate. His bed, large, four-posted, and gently draped with gauzy curtains, awaits him not with luxury, but with intention. Washington stands near the hearth, now reduced to dim coals. He begins to undress, not hastily, but with the same deliberate patience that shapes his every motion. A servant may assist him, but not tonight. He is capable still, and perhaps he prefers to be alone in this final hour. His waistcoat is removed and laid over a nearby chair. Then his shirt, carefully unbuttoned, its fabric faintly stiff from starch, but softened at the collar from wear. His nightshirt is pulled over his frame, the cotton draping loosely over shoulders. The candle by the bedside still burns gently, its light casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. He walks to the edge of the bed and sits, the mattress shifting beneath him. He does not lie down immediately. A thread of moonlight seeps through the edge of a shutter. The wind moves across the exterior wall with a sound like whispering paper. In the hallway, a board creaks with the shifting of air. But these sounds do not disturb. They are part of the home. They belong to the night. Instead, he allows the weight of the day to settle out of his spine, to drift from his shoulders and into the floorboards beneath him. His mind drifts in quiet waves, images of fields in summer, of Martha's voice in another room, of the sound of boots on frost-covered earth. Its chimneys rest. Its windows glisten faintly with dew. The animals in their stalls have quieted. The enslaved families in their quarters, long finished with their own quiet routines, have found what rest they can. The night wraps Mount Vernon in stillness. He thinks, perhaps, of old letters or of his mother's hands when he was a boy. No grand final thought marks the end of this day. No oration, no signature. Only the familiar peace of repetition. The end of another day in a long life made, more than anything, of days. The mind, when allowed to wander in peace, visits places the body cannot follow, and so he lets it go. And chest, carrying the faint scent of lye soap and cedarwood from the drawer in which it was stored. And then the dentures, those famous false teeth, not made of wood, as legend would later suggest, but of ivory and bone and metal springs. Painful, heavy, and always present. He removes them with slow, practiced care, placing them gently in their case. The relief is immediate, but unspoken. His jaw, finally freed from the day's burden, shifts subtly as he swallows, the absence familiar, but never quite comfortable. It is a private pain, one endured not with complaint, but with quiet stoicism. A wordless offering of gratitude, for health, for home, for the absence of conflict, for breath, for the ordinary mercy of having reached the end of the day in one piece. Then, with one slow motion, he lifts his legs onto the bed and leans back, drawing the covers over his body. The sheets are cool, the quilt heavy enough to press gently against his chest. He turns once, shifting his weight, then stills. He approaches the washstand. The water, poured earlier into the porcelain basin, is cool now. He splashes his face, not briskly, but with the same reverence he applies to every action. The towel nearby is soft, frayed at the edges from repeated use, folded just so. He wipes his hands and face, then dabs at his temples, where the skin is warm and lined from years of thought. The light of the room softens the sharpness of his features. He looks into the mirror, not with vanity, but with a kind of curiosity. He sees a man who has lived many lives in one. A final glance toward the hearth confirms the coals have dimmed enough to be left alone. Sometimes, in this moment, he would pray not aloud, not in the form of any long recitation, but inwardly. The candle is extinguished with a soft breath. The darkness that follows is not total, but near. He is not yet asleep. Minutes pass, maybe hours. Time in this state loses its shape. The house too slumbers now. George Washington, now asleep, breathes steadily. His chest rises and falls beneath the quilt. And so, as the candle smoke curls invisibly in the dark, and as the shadows settle into the grain of the floorboards, the great house dreams. There is a particular stillness that follows command. It is not relief, exactly, nor is it triumph. It is a kind of hollow quiet, a weight made of memory and consequence that sits softly on the shoulders long after the battlefield has gone silent. George Washington knew this silence intimately. Not the silence of victory parades, nor the hush that falls before the storm of war, but the deeper, more enduring quiet of decision. One learns much, after all, when words are few and attention is full. He did not fill silence with noise, but with consideration. Not fear, but order. The men under him grew to read his quiet as presence, not absence. When he passed, they stood straighter, not because he demanded it, but because his steadiness offered something rare, certainty. He absorbed them, learned from them, adjusted his course, and moved forward. One, from the trenches near Boston, tells of a moment when cannon fire rained down not far from his command tent. Officers rushed about. Horses bucked and men called for orders. Washington, seated at a table, did not flinch. He dipped his pen, continued writing. His calm did not come from ignorance of danger. It came from understanding that fear is a fire best smothered with stillness. He did not thrive on being right, but on being effective. And in the still corridors of his thoughts, strategy bloomed not as inspiration, but as structure. And in those forests, where paths wound uncertain beneath vast canopies and alliances shifted with the direction of the wind, Washington began building what would become the core of his leadership: calm, composure, and calculated command. He planned supplies. He tracked troop positions. He noted weather patterns, political tides, and morale with equal attention. And in those pages, between requests for gunpowder and updates on foreign alliances, he offered glimpses of himself, though rarely directly. His voice is steady even when facing retreat, measured even when describing loss. At Mount Vernon, long after the wars were fought, and even after the presidency concluded, he still walked the grounds with a mind trained for movement, always planning, observing, considering. The fields became his new campaign, the estate his new nation to balance and maintain. He logged the yields of his crops with the same meticulous care he once applied to the movement of battalions. He managed his letters, inventories, and building projects with the eye of one who knows that chaos begins in the details left untended. There is a steadiness that suggests not detachment, but discipline. The kind earned not by ease, but by enduring long nights with no clear answers and choosing, still, to act. The pause that stretches between a command given and the lives it will shape. The moments where leadership means not speaking, but carrying the burden inwardly, far from the ears of men. He was not the loudest among the founders, nor the most philosophically flamboyant, but in stillness he found strength, and in silence he became something more enduring than the clash of swords or the ink of declarations. He became a strategist of restraint. Long before he took the presidency, and even before the full bloom of the revolution, Washington was a man who cultivated internal discipline like others cultivate crops, with care, with patience, and above all, with observation. He watched, he listened, he measured. This was no accident of personality. It was a conscious armor, fitted piece by piece over years of service, rejection, reflection, and slow, hard-earned understanding. His was a life not launched from triumph, but tempered by failures, missteps, and second chances that never advertised themselves as such. Even as a young man, sent into the wilds of the Ohio Valley on missions of imperial urgency, He understood the price of speaking too quickly. In war, he spoke when needed, but only then. While others debated, raged, inspired with great orations, Washington would often sit, unmoving, hands folded lightly, eyes fixed on maps or men with equal clarity. And when he did speak, it was with words chosen like stones across a stream, spaced, deliberate, made to carry weight, not by volume, but by the silence that framed them. His headquarters, no matter where it stood, from frozen huts in Valley Forge to borrowed parlors in New York, was a place of discipline, not harshness. He wrote often, but never wasted ink. His letters, written with the same clarity he applied to command, reveal a mind concerned not with grandeur, but with stability. Even his errors, of which there were more than a few, were carried silently. He did not cloak them in excuse or noise. There are stories of Washington at war that speak to this quiet intensity. In private, the strategist remained. At Mount Vernon, long after the wars were fought, and even after the presidency concluded, he still walked the grounds with a mind trained for movement, always planning, observing, considering. The fields became his new campaign, the estate his new nation to balance and maintain. He questioned his own decisions more than he let on. And Washington, though never the most charismatic, never the most dazzling orator, understood the battlefield of perception more deeply than many gave him credit for. They were strategic acts, calculated not for applause, but for legacy, for structure, for the long-term balance of a country still in its infancy. His letters grew shorter, his entries more succinct, but the mind behind them never dimmed. He watched the unfolding of a nation, not with possessiveness, but with a deep, abiding hope that it would endure without him. Strategists often live in a state of partial wakefulness, long after the world has closed its eyes. Not as a soldier, not as a statesman, but as a man who had given all that he had to give, and who now entrusted the rest to time. The hum of possibilities, the echo of choices made and unmade, but in time, even that fades. His strategy in the end was not one of conquest or control, but of release. He understood that true strength lies in knowing when not to grasp, when not to speak, when not to rule. And so, he did not. They are murmurings, quiet releases of thought from mind to paper, like a deep exhale after holding in too much for too long. In the quiet of Mount Vernon, when the candles burned low and the house held its breath in the hours between dusk and sleep, George Washington would sometimes write such letters, not to be sent, not to be preserved, just to be written, to bring thought into form, to give shape to silence, to tell, if only briefly, the truth beneath the posture. These were the letters he never mailed, the ones folded gently, set aside, or left incomplete, the ones that bore no address, or whose ink faded under the weight of time and secrecy. He stepped away. He knew when to retreat, not just physically, but emotionally, politically, personally. His greatest victories often came not from action, but from withholding action, from stepping back when others rushed in, from seeing what would come next before others even realized there was a choice to be made. He pondered the impact of choices others believed to be certain. He carried the weight of bloodshed, even as the world praised him for liberation. His journals never shouted these things, but they whispered them. Quiet lines, subtle turns of phrase, questions posed not to others, but to time itself. He logged the yields of his crops with the same meticulous care he once applied to the movement of battalions. He managed his letters, inventories, and building projects with the eye of one who knows that chaos begins in the details left untended. And yet, for all his structure, for all his self-containment, Washington was not without doubt. That, too, lived in his silence. What separates a strategist from a commander is not power, but perspective. His refusal of a third presidential term, his voluntary return to private life, these were not mere gestures. And when he did, the silence he left behind spoke louder than any speech. In the final years of his life, that quiet deepened. He had led. Now he let go. In sleep, perhaps, his mind remained awake longer than his body. And so, on those final evenings before the candle dimmed, before the dog settled fully, before the ink dried on the last note, Washington sat once more in silence. Some words are never meant to travel far. They exist not for the eyes of others, but for the hands that write them. They are not declarations or instructions. They are murmurings, quiet releases of thought from mind to paper, like a deep exhale after holding in too much for too long. In the quiet of Mount Vernon, when the candles burned low and the house held its breath in the hours between dusk and sleep, George Washington would sometimes write such letters, not to be sent, not to be preserved, just to be written, to bring thought into form. Its surface, polished smooth by habit, had held countless documents, maps of terrain, drafts of presidential speeches, bills of lading from the estate, to give shape to silence, to tell, if only briefly, the truth beneath the posture. These were the letters he never mailed, the ones folded gently, set aside, or left incomplete, the ones that bore no address, or whose ink faded under the weight of time and secrecy. The desk in his study knew many such moments. But when the house was silent and the air outside turned cool and close, it also held the weight of softer things. A single sheet of paper, a pause between paragraphs, a pen set down, then picked up again. These were the nights when Washington turned inward, not out of grief or gloom, but from a lifelong instinct to reflect more than he revealed. He may have begun such letters with names, Dear Martha, or My dearest friend, or perhaps only a simple Sir, or To whom it may concern. His mornings came with stiffness, but even before the greeting was finished, something inside him hesitated, not out of fear, but out of restraint. For though his life was public, his mind belonged only to himself. One such letter, written in the early days of retirement, speaks not of politics nor of legacy, but of aging, of the quiet realization that the body no longer answers quite as it once did. His hand, though steady, had begun to slow, and his breath, at times, carried more effort than it used to. May you learn more from this stumble than from any step taken with ease. In the unsent lines of that letter, he reflected on the surprising gentleness of such awareness, not as tragedy, but as a kind of settling, a descent into the soil of a life long lived, full of labor and love and quiet burdens. He did not mourn youth. One, possibly to Lafayette, spoke of the strangeness of peace, the way it left the world quieter, yet somehow less complete. The moment passed, and with it, the desire to send. He merely noted its passing like the end of a season, a kind of reflection a man shares not with the nation, but with himself. Another letter never sealed, never sent, was meant for a soldier who had once disappointed him. The words were measured, but not harsh. He acknowledged failure, but extended forgiveness. He wrote not as a general, but as a man who had, in his youth, erred often and wished someone had written to him in kindness. The letter ended with a line he crossed out, then rewrote, a lesson he himself had learned over and over again. There were other letters, too, some addressed to old friends long gone, whose absence left certain conversations unfinished. He admitted to missing the urgency of shared purpose, even as he gave thanks for the stillness that replaced it. He never posted it. The moment passed, and with it, the desire to send. Perhaps the most tender of all were those he began to write to Martha, not as husband to wife, but as a man who understood that love, over time, transforms. That passion mellows into partnership. That shared hardship becomes the language of quiet companionship. These letters spoke not of romance, but of gratitude, of the thousand small ways she steadied his life. He wrote of her voice in the next room, of the way she folded linens, of how she read aloud from the Book of Common Prayer with her soft, even cadence, into the space between duty and desire. And he wrote of his fear not of dying, but of leaving her behind in a world still unsettled. And in the quiet corners of Mount Vernon, where no eyes could pry and no history books would tread, George Washington wrote to no one, and perhaps to everyone words that needed only to be written, not received. One letter trailed off mid-sentence, the pen leaving only a faint mark where thought outpaced word. There were drafts of resignation speeches, true ones never delivered. In them, he explored doubts more openly. Would his stepping down weaken the office? Would another be more easily corrupted? Because he knew, once sent, they lived forever. But on the page alone, they remained something else, a whisper, not a proclamation. A moment of truth lived in ink, not stone. His pen would move slowly. The scratching sound would fill the room like a breath. He would pause, begin again, sometimes finish, sometimes not. Then fold the letter, not to send, but to hold, to acknowledge. Was the fragile republic as strong as it seemed in sunlight, or was it all still a hope dressed in formality? These questions filled a page once. But by dawn, the doubts had faded, replaced by that practiced steadiness the world had come to expect from him. The paper was folded, perhaps burned, perhaps stored in a drawer, with other things too fragile for the public eye. Washington understood the power of words, and perhaps that is why he withheld so many of them. His unsent letters were not secrets, not shameful. They were the echoes of a thinking man. A man who had stood on battlefields, faced kings and congresses, held the weight of a newborn nation in his hands, and who, despite all this, still questioned, still hoped, still felt deeply enough to write words the world would never read. And so, in the deep of night, while the fire dimmed and the wind outside traced the eaves of the house like a lullaby, he would sit with those thoughts. And by morning, the pages might be tucked away, into a drawer, into a book. These were the letters of a man who carried more than his country. He carried himself, his silence, his truth. And in the quiet corners of Mount Vernon, where no eyes could pry and no history books would tread, George Washington wrote to no one, and perhaps to everyone words that needed only to be written, not received. It is easy now to see the presidency as a given, a rhythm. His journals shifted from the chaos of war to the yields of harvest. His nights were punctuated not by urgent knocks on the door, but by the quiet creak of shutters and the low breathing of sleeping dogs. The office was little more than a notion wrapped in ceremony. There were no firm protocols, no tested guidelines, only questions. How should he be addressed? How closely should he walk among the people? How visible should he remain? And how distant must he be to preserve the dignity of the role? Every movement became precedent. Every sentence, a model. Every silence, a signal. And Washington knew deeply, quietly, that his actions were writing the first grammar of American leadership. But when the call came again, he answered, not out of desire, but necessity. Because to him, the young republic was fragile as glass. And though he longed to remain where the ground was known and the skies gentle, he understood that sometimes a man must leave peace behind to guard its very future. A role that exists year after year, passed from one suited figure to the next with ceremony and oath. But once it was not a role, it was a risk. Once it had no precedent, no blueprint, no guardrails. And once it rested upon the shoulders of one man who did not seek it, did not covet it, and yet could not refuse it. George Washington did not step into the presidency with fire in his eyes or ambition at his back. He stepped into it the way one steps into the cold sea at dawn, slowly, quietly, aware of the depth that waits. And what he found in those waters was not the roar of power, but the silence of weight. The presidency for him was never a crown. It was a burden shaped like duty. At Mount Vernon, where the air tasted of turned soil and old timber, Where the trees bore witness to years of familiar footsteps, Washington had already found a kind of peace. He left Mount Vernon with the same solemnity he once reserved for battle. His carriage pulled away not with fanfare in his heart, but with a growing stillness. He looked out at the fields as fields, and knew they would go untended by his hand for years. He did not speak of sadness, but it settled into the lines beside his mouth, and into the silence that hung between his words during the journey north. Even as cheers rang through cities, and church bells pealed in celebration of his election, he remained composed. Inside, the weight had already begun to settle across his chest. In New York, the seat of the government at the time, the presidency took on form, but barely. The office was little more than a notion wrapped in ceremony. There were no firm protocols, no tested guidelines. Only questions. How should he be addressed? How closely should he walk among the people? But habit dies slowly, and so does the sense that work must begin before the sun. His mornings were often filled with correspondence. Pages and pages arriving each day, stacked and sorted and awaiting his attention. He read carefully, replied thoughtfully. But even as his pen moved, the unseen weight continued to press against him. There were no pitched battles, but there were days of tense negotiation. There were no cannons, but there were factions and feuds, rising and falling like tides within his cabinet. He watched as trusted men grew distant, as ideals clashed with the compromise of governance, as ambition whispered behind closed doors. And through it all, he remained still, a mountain amidst storm clouds, knowing that the Republic, still so new, was watching his silhouette for reassurance. For in every letter lay a thread of hope, of fear, of expectation, and he somehow was meant to weave them all into a nation. Mornings when he stared at letters unopened, when his pen hovered above the page, unable to move, where he could be George again, and not Mr. President, where trees grew in cycles, he understood, and the soil responded to his touch. In the rare quiet moments between the clamor of governance, he would close his eyes and picture the hallway at home, the warm wood, the dog's soft steps, the familiar scent of beeswax and parchment. Those moments never lasted long, but they were enough to steady him. When the silence of the room grew loud, filled with all the things he could not say, did he doubt himself? Likely, yes. Did he wonder if another man, younger perhaps, more agile with politics, might have steered the ship better? Almost certainly. But none of this reached the public. He kept such thoughts between himself and the firelight, folded into corners of his mind that only solitude could access. How visible should he remain, and how distant must he be to preserve the dignity of the role? Every movement became precedent, every sentence a model, every silence a signal. And Washington knew deeply, quietly, that his actions were writing the first grammar of American leadership. He rose early, earlier than many would expect for a man in such position. Public life was no ball. Crowds followed him. Strangers tried to read his eyes. Newspapers dissected his smallest gestures. Yet none truly saw the man who walked between columns of marble with his hands clasped gently behind his back. A man who bore not only the title of president, but the role of symbol. He was no longer merely Washington. He was the Republic embodied, a figure upon whom millions projected dreams, anxieties, and ideals, while he, in turn, simply tried to hold the whole thing together. He carried himself with calm, because calm was required. He smiled rarely, because too wide a grin could be misread. He delivered his messages in careful tones, because a single sharp word might ripple across fragile waters. Every decision, even minor, became a stone dropped into a pool with endless rings. He wore black often not for mourning, but for neutrality, for balance, for solemnity. He accepted the praise with grace. But he knew that underneath it often was the trembling hope of a people unsure if the experiment would hold. A presidency aged him in ways that even war had not. There were moments, unrecorded and unspoken, when the weight became too much even for him. Nights where the candle burned longer than usual. He longed for Mount Vernon, not as a place of escape, but as a place of truth, where he could be George again, and not Mr. President. Where trees grew in cycles, he understood, and the soil responded to his touch. In the rare quiet moments between the clamor of governance, he would close his eyes and picture the hallway at home, the worn wood, the dog's soft steps, the familiar scent of beeswax and parchment. Those moments never lasted long, but they were enough to steady him. And when the time came to step away, he did so not with relief, but with reverence. Not because the work was over, but because a different kind of tending was needed. Rounds off their edges, smooths their contradictions, and sets them up on pedestals too high for truth to reach. Stories grow, layer upon layer, until the person beneath them begins to vanish. And when we speak of George Washington, it is often not the man we are speaking of, but the myth. The tall, solemn figure with eyes fixed toward the horizon, eternally chiseled in marble. The perfect posture, the powdered hair, the sword and sash. The cherry tree that never fell by his hand, the truth that never trembled on his lips. And yet, the real Washington was quieter than all that. Softer, more uncertain. Less hero than human, less statue than soil-rooted, real, and given to long silences. He did not walk in grandeur. He walked in thought. And in that simple act, in leaving rather than lingering, he gave the role its shape, and gave the nation, at last, a model not just of leadership, but of letting go. He refused a third term, not out of exhaustion alone, but because he believed that even power must bow to principle. It lingered in his bones, in his gait, in the corners of his thoughts. But it no longer crushed. That was the final weight. Not of decision, but of hope. He had done what he could. Now it was up to others. It rested upon him now like an old coat, familiar, worn, but no longer oppressive. He resumed his walks. He resumed his letters. And though the title would follow him always, he allowed himself gently, gradually to become again what he had once been. A man, a farmer, a husband, a figure no longer on the currency of the moment, but on the quiet edges of legacy. That leadership is not proven in how long one clings, but in knowing when to let go. His farewell address, penned with the help of trusted hands, was not a victory speech. It was a meditation on fragility. A candle held out into a young and uncertain night, offered with hope that it might burn without him. When he returned home, the weight did not disappear. And even then, as the evenings grew darker, and the fire once again became his companion, he would sit near the window, watching the sky dim, and wonder not whether he had done enough, but whether the nation would do enough with what had been begun. And so, the first president set down the mantle, and picked up a pruning hook. There is a strange thing that happens with time. It polishes people, rounds off their edges, smooths their contradictions, and sets them up on pedestals too high for truth to reach. Stories grow, layer upon layer, until the person beneath them begins to vanish. And when we speak of George Washington, it is often not the man we are speaking of, but the myth. The tall, solemn figure with eyes fixed toward the horizon, eternally chiseled in marble. The perfect posture, the powdered hair, the sword and sash. The cherry tree that never fell by his hand, the truth that never trembled on his lips. And Washington knew this. He knew that myths comfort, that they endure where nuance crumbles. And so he bore it. He allowed the stories to grow, while holding tightly to the parts of himself no statue would capture. It did not show the man who laughed rarely, but when he did, let it bubble up and warm. Private company shoulders relaxed, eyes crinkling at the edges. It did not show the man who worried, in the quiet of his own room, that perhaps he had not done enough, that the republic might yet fall, that others might steer it wrong. And yet, The real Washington was quieter than all that, softer, more uncertain. Less hero than human, less statue than soil-rooted real, but because he understood its power. His every move would teach. His every hesitation would echo. And so, he measured his days not by ease, but by impact. He held his temper not because he lacked it, but because he knew the cost of letting it show. He refrained from speaking when words would have scorched. This restraint, so easily mistaken for serenity, was in fact the hardest discipline of all. And given to long silences, he did not walk in grandeur. He walked in thought. In his lifetime, Washington was already becoming myth. The stories began early, and often without his consent. Even during the Revolution, tales of his courage, his dignity, his moral perfection were spreading faster than horses could carry letters. Strangers would stare, waiting for him to say something profound. When offered the term His Excellency or Your Highness, he gently steered conversations back toward Mr. President. He walked among the people when possible. He opened his doors. He stood not behind palaces, but in open chambers, where all could see that he was, at most, a steward of something larger. Artists painted him in poses he found too elaborate. Poets cast him in verses that made him uncomfortable. In private letters, he expressed mild astonishment at the reverence. He did not see himself as the father of a nation. He saw himself as its servant. And servants, he believed, ought not to be deified. He had become something symbolic, a living emblem of virtue and resolve, and yet he had never claimed to be such. He merely did what he felt needed doing, and kept the rest to himself. He was aware of the myth. It surrounded him like a coat he could not take off, even when it grew heavy. And so, quietly, he resisted. Not openly, not defiantly, but in small, deliberate ways. He declined titles that placed him above the people. Still, the myth continued. It was easier to worship a figure than to wrestle with the complexity of a man. The myth did not show the man who worried over his reputation, not out of vanity. The myth did not show the man who kept to a simple diet, who preferred tea to wine, who walked his grounds more than he read poetry. It did not show the man who laughed rarely, but when he did, let it bubble up and warm, private company shoulders relaxed, eyes crinkling at the edges. It did not show the man who worried, in the quiet of his own room, that perhaps he had not done enough. There were no grand words in that moment. Only breath and morning light, and the ache of a long life lived in service. That the republic might yet fall, that others might steer it wrong. The false teeth pressed constantly. His joints stiffened with the years. The long rides, the wartime bivouacs, the daily weight of duty, these all left their marks. Yet he never sought pity, not because he was immune to suffering, but because he believed his suffering should never become someone else's burden. The myth did not show the man who, when he thought no one was watching, stood at the window just before dawn, watching the mist rise off the Potomac, hands behind his back, saying nothing, and there was an ache. Washington bore pain of body and of spirit with a stoicism that fed the myth. But the truth is, he was never without discomfort. And yet, he was not made of stone. He wept sometimes. When close friends died, when he returned home after long absence and saw how much had changed, when letters came bearing news that struck too close to the heart. He wrote of these things obliquely, often in only a sentence or two. But the emotion lived between the lines, quiet, immense, carefully managed. The myth could not contain contradiction, but the man did. Washington was a revolutionary who valued order, a slaveholder who wrote of liberty, a deeply moral man who participated in systems now seen, rightly, as unforgivable. He was not unaware of these tensions. He wrestled with them in private. He took steps halting, imperfect, to reckon with them. And he knew, perhaps more than most, that no man can live in history without being shaped by its flaws. But myths do not make room for flaws. They require purity. And so, over time, Washington the myth eclipsed Washington the man. School children memorized his birthday. Towns bore his name. Mountains, bridges, capitals. Paintings showed him noble, unwrinkled, always calm. But the man who sat late by the fire, whose fingers ached in the cold, who doubted, who endured, who aged remained quietly behind the curtain. And yet, it is the man we find most comforting, because he chose to act even when unsure, because he stepped forward even when the path was fogged, because he bore the myth not to glorify himself, but to protect something greater, not because he was perfect, but because he was not, because he rose each day under the same weight we all carry, the weight of uncertainty, of responsibility, of memory. And so, as we lie back and listen now, perhaps with eyes closed, breath slowing, it is not the Washington of coins and monuments we hear. It is the Washington who stirred his tea in silence, who folded letters by candlelight, who stood by the window in the hush before sunrise, who sat in the dark, alone with his thoughts. That man is still there, beneath the marble, behind the name, waiting quietly in the shadows of memory, where real things live, where myths fade, and where the human, finally, can be seen. Beneath the still face of portraits and the firm line of every engraving, behind the steady jawline we see carved in monuments, there was discomfort. Quiet, persistent, daily pain born not with complaint, but with patience. George Washington, to the world, stood unshaken. In truth, Washington's dentures were a patchwork of the 18th century as best solutions to a problem that modern medicine had yet to conquer. Ivory, most often from hippopotamus or elephant. Human teeth, sometimes purchased or harvested from donors. In letters, he would refer casually to visits from his dentist, to fittings and adjustments. But the tone was always spare, the words measured. He acknowledged the inconvenience, but not the pain. He reserved that part for silence. Lead and brass fittings, wire springs and metal pins. These were not refined prosthetics. They were crude, often ill-fitting constructions. And for the man who wore them, they were not symbols of age or weakness, but necessities of dignity. But beneath that stoic composure was a body that endured far more than it revealed. Accounts suggest that his first tooth was extracted in his 20s. Over the years, one by one, the rest followed. Poor dental hygiene, then poorly understood, likely played a role. So too did the popular treatments of the time mercury-laced tinctures, corrosive tonics, harsh powders that scrub it away more than just surface decay. And as the pain worsened, so too did the remedies. Extractions were done by force, without anesthetic, the roots pulled from the jaw with steel and grit. And among the many burdens he carried, few were as constant or as quietly endured as the aching absence of his teeth. It is a small detail, perhaps, a human flaw in the great silhouette of history, and yet it tells us so much, not of failure, but of fortitude, not of vanity, but of endurance. It is not the kind of story etched in marble, but one felt in the silent clench of a jaw beneath candlelight, in the slow, careful chewing of bread, in the decision to speak less so as to hurt less. This is the story of Washington's false teeth, and the pain he carried behind his smile. Contrary to the myths, they were never wooden. That image so strangely persistent is not rooted in fact, but perhaps in metaphor. Washington began losing his teeth early. By the time he was in his 40s, only a handful remained. But Washington, ever composed, rarely wrote of his suffering in anything more than brief mentions. In letters, Washington would refer casually to visits from his dentist, to fittings and adjustments. But the tone was always spare, the words measured. He acknowledged the inconvenience, but not the pain. He reserved that part for silence. His dentures, painstakingly made by John Greenwood, one of the early American dentists, were heavy, awkward, and prone to misalignment. They distorted his face subtly, pushing the jaw forward. Observers noted his tightly closed lips in portraits, the careful way he spoke, the deliberate, often slow cadence of his public addresses. It was not performance. It was management. Every word had to be chosen not just for content, but for comfort. By the time he assumed the presidency, he had only one natural tooth remaining: speaking, smiling. These simple acts, once automatic, became sources of deliberation. Washington never let it affect his discipline, but it must have touched his spirit. How could it not? The gums, raw from the day's wear, would throb gently as he lay down. He did not sleep with them in. Few did. Instead, he lay quietly in the dark, feeling the release of pressure, the freedom of silence. Who had smiled with restraint, not from arrogance, but from ache, a human thing. But perhaps that is why it matters. Because it reminds us that behind every myth, behind every formal portrait, and every firm-lipped engraving, there is a pulse, a body, a man who hurt, the man who had endured, not for glory, but for continuity, for the sense that the office he held, the nation he shaped, deserved his steadiness, even when it cost him. And perhaps, in that moment, he felt most himself. The man who had once ridden horses for days at a time, who had shouted across battlefields, who had spoken to rooms full of soldiers with clarity and calm, now found each sentence measured against discomfort. Carefully, a ritual born of habit and necessity. He would set them beside him, sometimes in a case, sometimes on a linen cloth. The dentures became part of him, as did the silence they imposed. He learned to let others speak first, to speak briefly, to write more. He became, if anything, more introspective. And perhaps it was in this quiet reshaping of himself that we see the true strength of the man, not in the battles he won, but in the burdens he bore without noise. Greenwood did his best, crafting devices with springs and screws, hand-carved to match the shape of Washington's jaw, but the materials were unforgiving. The ivory cracked, the metal corroded, the human teeth salvaged from unknown mouths sometimes loosened or failed to match. Yet Washington wore them, not because they worked well, but because they worked enough. The relief was immediate, but so too was the vulnerability. To be without them was to be less seen, less presentable, less presidential. And so, even in pain, he often kept them in place longer than comfort would have advised. And in the quiet hours, when the speeches ended, and the crowds faded, and he sat alone by the hearth, the dentures would be removed. He was fitted for multiple sets over the years, each one slightly different, each one a compromise. He continued to ride, to host, to lead, all while managing this private discomfort. He ate sparingly in public. He chose soft foods, favored spoon over knife. When entertaining guests at Mount Vernon, he often sat back quietly at table, speaking only when needed, smiling only with restraint. He did not hide, but he did adapt. And the pain was not only physical. There is something quietly heavy in losing the parts of oneself that once acted without thought. Chewing. Yet he never asked for pity. That was not his way. At night, when the fire dimmed and the house fell still, he would remove the dentures, wash his face, and let his mouth rest. The soreness would linger, not the president, not the general, but simply George, the man who had teeth pulled in candlelit rooms, who had clenched through pain during receptions. And so, in the history books, this story is often left out. It is not grand, it is not dramatic, it is a detail, and still led, and still endured. Long after the candles had been lit and the corridors hushed to whispers, after the shutters were drawn against the Virginia night, and the house began its long descent into rest, there was one companion that never failed to wait for George Washington: the written word. In his quietest moments, in those final hours between the duties of the day and the drift of sleep, Books became more than paper and ink. They became a ritual, a retreat, a conversation spoken in silence between the man and the minds that had come before him. And so, with the fire settling into its last orange glow and the air cool against the windows, Washington would select a volume not for entertainment, not to pass the time, but to reflect. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. Washington underlined that line once. It was not for others to see. It was for him to remember that the work of being good was daily, interior, unseen, to return to thought, to finish the day not with the world's noise, but with its wisdom. His library at Mount Vernon was not the largest of his day, but it was deliberate. Built piece by piece over a lifetime, it revealed not just his intellect, but his priorities. His hand would slide along the shelf, pausing on familiar bindings, fingers brushing the leather covers, as if reacquainting himself with old friends. He knew where each one lived. He knew how the pages smelled, where the margins bore his light penciled notes, and where time had softened the corners with repeated turning. Nearly 900 volumes filled the shelves, each one touched by hand, carefully chosen, often read more than once. There was comfort in those stories, not because they flattered, but because they humbled. They reminded him that greatness often came hand in hand with contradiction, that the path through power was never smooth, and that the choices made in quiet solitude often mattered more than those made beneath banners. They stood in order, their spines aligned in quiet procession, bearing titles in Latin and English, gold embossed and cloth bound, heavy with age and meaning. There were books on war, yes, and on farming and architecture, law and nationhood. But there were also books on morality, philosophy, religion, and ancient empires long since gone to dust. These were not the trophies of a reader. They were tools, teachers, mirrors. And in the evening, after tea had been taken and letters folded closed, he would often drift toward them, not with urgency, but with instinct. Sometimes he read from Plutarch's Ancient Lives rendered in gentle prose, full of reflections on leadership, virtue, failure, and fate. He read Marcus Aurelius' two meditations dog-eared in places, its language firm but gentle, like a steady hand upon the shoulder. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. Washington underlined that line once. It was not for others to see. It was for him to remember that the work of being good, interior, unseen. The Bible sat near his bed, not always opened, not always quoted, but near. He did not speak of his faith with dramatic flourishes. It lived in his routines, in his preference for moderation, in the weight he gave to honesty and duty. Washington read these not to debate, but to understand. He believed deeply that to lead well, one must first learn to listen. And in the margins of those texts, sometimes he wrote small notes. Its flame flickered gently, reflecting in his eyes, which by then had grown tired with age. He would read slowly, pausing often, sometimes mouthing the words, sometimes letting them hang in the space above him before turning the page. The night outside deepened. The house creaked with sleep, and in that quiet, the words on the page met no resistance. A word, a question mark, a line drawn next to an idea that needed more thought. When he did read from Scripture, it was often from Psalms. Not the thunderous passages, but the ones that whispered of still waters and quiet strength. And so, he turned to the past, not to escape, but to reflect, to hold his own time up to the light of others. There were works on the Enlightenment, Addison, and Locke, treatises on civil government and the human condition. And then, there were the practical books, the ones he read because he cared for his land. Guides on crop rotation, manuals on livestock, volumes on drainage, soil, and seasonal yield. He read them not for amusement, but for mastery. These were the books he read in the morning, with the day ahead. But some nights, he would return to them still curious about a better way to plant, or a solution to a problem on the North Field. Even in his final years, long after he had carried the weight of an entire nation on his back, he remained a student of the earth. He rarely read fiction. It wasn't that he disliked stories. It was that he found enough complexity in truth. History offered all the characters he needed. In bed, he read sitting upright, propped by pillows, quilt drawn to his waist, a candle placed nearby on a low table. Its flame flickered gently, reflecting in his eyes, which by then had grown tired with age. He would read slowly, pausing often, sometimes mouthing the words, sometimes letting them hang in the space above him before turning the page. The night outside deepened. The house creaked with sleep, and in that quiet, the words on the page met no resistance. He did not always finish a chapter. Often, the book would rest gently on his chest, forgotten as sleep took over. Or he would close it with a sigh, mark his place with a ribbon or a folded scrap, and set it carefully on the bedside table. In those moments, the book did not end. It simply paused, waiting for another night, another hour of solitude. To pages, to thought, to the still, steady company of books that neither flattered nor judged, it walks softly across polished floorboards, steps carefully over thresholds, and leaves no footprints, only a memory of stillness. This is not the power of empires or parades. It is the power that grows slowly, shaped not by domination, but by discipline. And George Washington, though shaped by war and placed upon the highest pedestal of a new republic, was in many ways a man devoted to quiet power, the kind that must be cultivated, not seized, the kind that lives in the spaces between words, in the pause before a reply, in the choice to speak less rather than more. It was not a posture for effect. It was a practice rooted in the culture of his time, in the codes of civility, in the traditions of a class that believed true strength should never shout, but simply offered their wisdom and waited for the turning of the next page. Some books traveled with him on campaign to the capital, across state lines. Their pages bore the dust of many rooms, but most remained at Mount Vernon. They lived where he lived. We glimpsed the part of him that never led armies, never addressed Congress, never stood on balconies, or rode beneath banners. We glimpsed the learner, the reader, the seeker of calm truths. They absorbed the scent of wood smoke and ink, of the surrounding forests, of paper worn by touch. They were not symbols. They were companions. And so, when we imagine him now as the figure on currency, or the statue beneath stone, but as a man beneath a quilt, candle burning low, eyes reading slowly in the hush before dreams, we glimpsed something deeper. These were his final hours each night, not spent in noise, but in quiet return. There is a kind of power that does not raise its voice. It does not arrive with fanfare, nor demand the room's attention. It walks softly across polished floorboards, steps carefully over thresholds, and leaves no footprints, only a memory of stillness. This is not the power of empires or parades. It is the power that grows slowly, shaped not by domination, but by discipline. Manners were not merely social performance. They were instruments of structure. When others gestured widely, he folded his hands. When tempers rose, he kept his voice low. When attention turned toward him, as it so often did, he bore it without reaching for it. He did not posture. He positioned. He let his presence work not through command, but through constancy. A gentleman's silence could speak louder than declarations. A bowed head, a well-timed pause, a slow turn of the hand on a cane. These were languages of power as nuanced as trees. From an early age, Washington was steeped in this environment. He read, copied, and internalized the rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation, a list of maxims rooted in European courtly behavior. But for him, these were not superficial gestures. They were a means of shaping the self, of keeping temper in check, of transforming personal discipline into public influence. And George Washington, though shaped by war and placed upon the highest pedestal of a new republic, was in many ways a man devoted to quiet power, the kind that must be cultivated, not seized, the kind that lives in the spaces between words, in the pause before a reply, in the choice to speak less rather than more. It was not a posture for effect. It was a practice rooted in the culture of his time, in the codes of civility, in the traditions of a class that believed true strength should never shout. In 18th century Virginia, the gentry lived according to a rhythm both formal and unhurried. He mastered stillness. Visitors to Mount Vernon often remarked on his bearing. He was tall, yes, over 6 feet, but his height did not dominate. Rather, it grounded him. His movements were deliberate. He sat straight-backed. He listened before responding. He rarely interrupted. And even when his face revealed little, his attention was complete. That focus, that unwavering eye contact, carried weight. It made those who spoke feel the full gravity of their own words. This kind of power, quiet, composed, precise, was not accidental. It was cultivated through habit. Washington rose early. He dressed with care. He walked his property daily, observing, correcting, planning. Even his clothing reflected balance. Formal, but not ostentatious. Neat, but not ornate. His boots polished, his cuffs aligned, his buttons simple. He projected dignity not through extravagance, but through restraint. In governance, this quiet power became the foundation of trust. While others lobbied, maneuvered, or declaimed, Washington simply remained consistent. Even when writing to friends, his words bore the same calm rhythm. No excess, no embellishment. Just clarity, just intention. That, too, was a kind of strength. He did not speak often in debate, but when he did, people listened. His words carried weight precisely because he used them sparingly. There was always the sense that he could say more, that the reservoir of thought ran deep beneath the calm surface. That, in itself, became power. He understood that influence was often best exerted indirectly, through tone, through example, through quiet refusal to be drawn into spectacle. He did not seek to dominate rooms, but he anchored them. And in doing so, he offered something rare, stability. During the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, debates became heated, tempers flared, voices rose. And yet, through it all, Washington, who presided over the convention, remained mostly silent. He spoke rarely, only when necessary, and yet his presence alone was enough to restore focus. Delegates would lower their voices when he looked up. Arguments softened when he simply adjusted his posture, not because he demanded obedience, but because his very silence reminded them of what was at stake. A sense that even when storms raged in politics or war, he would not be swept away, that his calm would outlast chaos. But as a steward of a system that required order and clarity, his directions were clear, his expectations known. He believed in structure not as constraint, but as a pathway to peace. The quiet power he cultivated in public found its echo in his domestic life. Routines kept, books organized, correspondence filed. The balance of a life lived deliberately. There is a story often told, one that embodies this cultivated presence. At home, he practiced the same composure. He ran Mount Vernon not as a king over subjects. Even in personal correspondence, this tone endured. He wrote with precision, rarely with flair, always with purpose. Even when writing to friends, Washington's words bore the same calm rhythm. No excess, no embellishment, just clarity, just intention. That, too, was a kind of strength. And in this cultivation of quiet power, he created space for others to grow, to reflect, to adjust themselves. People did not feel overpowered by his presence. They felt steadied by it. His calm created calm. His silence opened room for other voices. His restraint encouraged reason. There were times, of course, when he had to raise his voice. Not the firework, but the candle. Not the drumbeat, but the breath. Washington's life teaches us that not all strength is loud, that not all leadership needs to announce itself. Sometimes it is enough to stand still, to breathe evenly, to wait until the right word arrives, and then offer it with care. When the country demanded not only composure, but command, and he answered those calls. But when the moment passed, he returned to stillness. He never clung to the center. He receded, allowed others to step forward. He understood that true power is not in permanence, but in presence. Even in portraiture, Washington's quiet strength was rendered in posture, not expression. Where footsteps seem to echo more softly, and time feels slower, older, deeper. Mount Vernon is such a place. It is not only the home of George Washington, nor merely the estate that bears the dust and breath of the nation's first president. It is something quieter than legacy, and more intimate than history. It is a house built not for grandeur, but for equilibrium. A landscape sculpted not to impress, but to reflect. And now, long after the candles have gone out, and the floors no longer creak beneath his measured steps, what remains is a kind of archaeology of solitude, gentle unearthing of how a man shaped his space, and how that space in turn shaped his silence. He is rarely shown with a broad smile, rarely shown in action. He stands or sits composed. A man who leads not by conquering, but by calming. A man who holds a nation's hopes in his steady hands, and does not let them tremble. And so, in the softness of night, when the lamps are low and the world leans towards sleep, this version of power becomes clearer. It is easy to admire the bold, but it is in the quiet, in the cultivated, composed silence that we often find the kind of power that endures. There are places where solitude lingers like perfume, long after the voices have gone, where footsteps seem to echo more softly, and time feels slower, older, deeper. Mount Vernon is such a place. It is not only the home of George Washington, nor merely the estate that bears the dust. Each room, each hallway, each garden path was touched by Washington's hand, not only as a builder, but as a steward of feeling. Washington understood space, not merely as something to be filled, but something to be felt. And so, the symmetry of the mansion, the balance of the wings, the alignment of doorways, the careful framing of light through windows, was not architectural vanity. Gravel paths curled gently between hedges, past beds of vegetables and flowers. There is beauty, yes, but always in service of rhythm. To walk those gardens, especially near dusk, is to walk into Washington's inner landscape. Every hedge trimmed, every gate latched, every row aligned. Not because he was rigid, but because he believed in harmony between man and land, between labor and reward, between structure and peace. It was emotional geometry. It was his way of creating calm and breath of a nation's first president. It stretched from front to back, allowing the breeze from the Potomac to move freely through, cooling the air in summer, stirring the curtains like a sigh. But onto utility fields in ordered rows, orchards pruned with care, fences mended and neat. His writing desk was not ornate. Its drawers were practical, its surface worn by time, its legs sturdy. This was where he wrote letters, planned harvests, read reports. This was where his mind returned each day, not to power, but to responsibility. The archaeology of solitude here lies in the quiet presence of tools, quills, ink, ledgers. All instruments of thought, not display. To either side, rooms unfolded in harmonious order, dining parlors, drawing rooms, studies, none overwhelming, none diminished. Washington had no desire for palatial scale. What he built instead was coherence, a house that whispered rather than shouted. It is something quieter than legacy and more intimate than history. It is a house built not for grandeur, but for equilibrium. A landscape sculpted not to impress, but to reflect. And now, long after the candles have gone out and the floors no longer creak beneath his measured steps, what remains is a kind of archaeology of solitude, gentle unearthing of how a man shaped his space and how that space in turn shaped his silence. To walk through Mount Vernon today is to step through layers of intention. The central passageway, wide and light-filled, anchored the house like a spine. In the study, where his desk still rests beneath the morning light, the windows look out, not onto spectacle. Beyond the house, the gardens stretch with a similar restraint. They are not wild. They are not overly ornate. They are cultivated, precise, formal, yet soft. Gravel paths curl gently between hedges, past beds of vegetables and flowers. There is beauty, yes, but always in service of rhythm. To walk those gardens, especially near dusk, is to walk into Washington's inner landscape. The piazza along the river-facing side of the house, the long covered porch, with its white columns, was not merely an architectural flourish. The walls painted in soft hues, the furniture practical. The bed itself, where he would later pass from this world, stood beneath a canopy, not of wealth, but of quiet. The pencil mark in a ledger. The way the light touches the corner of a writing desk at 4 o'clock on a spring afternoon. It is found in the faint smell of wood smoke absorbed into the walls. In the scratch marks where a chair was often pushed back. In the drawer that sticks slightly, because it was opened too often. These are the traces he left behind, not declarations, but impressions. There were no grand tapestries, no golden accents. Only the softness of fabric, the closeness of breath, and the weight of years lived deliberately. It was a threshold between duties and reflection. It was the one place where Washington could control the design, where he could take chaos and impose calm, where each decision, where to plant, how to build, when to harvest, reflected his yearning for balance. He could not control the weather, nor the politics of the young republic, but he could control the slope of a path, the curve of a railing, the spacing of tulips. And in that control, he found quiet. He would often sit there in the evening, watching the water change color with the sky, listening to the distant sounds of workers finishing their tasks, of birds settling in the trees. It was there that solitude took shape, not as loneliness, but as renewal. Every hedge trimmed, every gate latched, every row aligned. Not because he was rigid, but because he believed in harmony between man and land, between labor and reward, between structure and peace. The outbuildings tell their own quiet stories. The blacksmith's forge, the spinning house, the smokehouse, the quarters where enslaved men and women lived and worked, each structure positioned with purpose, each role woven into the larger life of the estate. Washington observed all of it, not with distance, but with deliberation. He walked the grounds. He spoke with his overseers. He made notes. He adjusted. He understood that to manage a world, however small one, must remain close to it. Yet even within this bustling system, he carved out places of retreat. Even his bedchamber spoke of this desire for peace. Modest, well-ordered, with a view that opened east toward the dawn. And still, Mount Vernon was not merely a refuge from public life. It was also a canvas. The archaeology of solitude is not found in grand artifacts. It is found in the wear of a step, the scuff on a threshold, the pencil mark in a ledger, the way the light touches the corner of a writing desk at 4 o'clock on a spring afternoon. It waits in the corners. It lingers in the stairwell. To hear through wood and stone what Washington himself never said aloud, that solitude is not the absence of others, but the presence of the self. That power, to endure, must be paired with peace. That legacy is not written only in law or battle, but in the daily cultivation of space, of order, of breath. It clings to the window panes, especially in the early morning, when dew still rests on the glass, and the Potomac glimmers like old silver in the distance. It is not a haunted silence, It is a chosen one, to exist in the quiet he so carefully made. A silence born of long thought, of practiced restraint, of a life designed not for applause, but for coherence. It is found in the faint smell of wood smoke absorbed into the walls, in the scratch marks where a chair was often pushed back, in the drawer that sticks slightly because it was opened too often. These are the traces he left behind, not declarations, but impressions. Even now, when the house stands as a museum, and visitors pass through in steady, reverent lines, the silence he cultivated remains. To walk Mount Vernon today is to listen with your eyes. And so, as the day fades once more, and the shadows grow long along the garden wall, the house seems to remember. The breeze moves through the open porch, just as it did 200 years ago. The floorboards rest in the same patterns. The air, still faintly sweet with the scent of grass and earth, carries no urgency, only rhythm. And somewhere in that rhythm, if one listens closely enough, one might still hear the footfalls of a man walking his home, not to be seen, not to be known, but simply to be. To exist in the quiet he so carefully made. In the soft hours of Mount Vernon's evenings where candlelight flickered low and footsteps slowed to a murmur, there existed another presence. One not always placed at the center of history's grand paintings, but quietly woven through every hallway, every chamber, every shared glance over supper. Martha Washington. Her name, so often said as an accessory to her husband's, carried its own quiet gravity. It was a union of understanding, of similar temperament, of mutual trust. They did not write each other love letters thick with poetry. What little correspondence survives between them is brief, restrained, respectful. And yet, within those lines scant, though they are, one sees the deep familiarity of two people who knew the importance of consistency over passion and presence over poetry. Not as the wife of a president, not merely the mistress of a household, but as the steady, ever-present half of a life lived in the rhythm of partnership. Not in title alone, but in fact. She oversaw the hiring and direction of household staff. She made decisions about food stores, ordering of goods, the care of guests, the distribution of clothing to the enslaved community. Her days began early, and her work was visible in the seamless rhythm of Mount Vernon's daily life. She held the house together with her handwriting, her presence in the still room, her constant regard for detail. Her world was not one built on speeches or armies. It was stitched together through linens folded just so, letters written with a practiced hand, tea poured at the same hour each evening. And within that carefully tended world, there was a shared solitude, a quiet communion between her and George that did not shout its name, but hummed gently beneath the days. She arrived into Washington's life, not as a stranger to responsibility, but as a widow, a mother, and the mistress of a large estate. She had known loss already, her first husband, 2 of her 4 children, and yet her presence never bore the sharpness of grief. It held something softer, more composed. Martha Custis, before she was Washington, had learned early the art of adaptation. And it was this quiet adaptability that she carried with her to Mount Vernon, a kind of internal stillness that did not resist change, but met it with grace. Their marriage, though often draped in the silks of patriot mythology, was not born of romantic flair. When George was away leading armies, shaping a nation, Martha managed the estate. When George was away leading armies, shaping a nation, Martha managed the estate. Not in title alone, but in fact. She oversaw the hiring and direction of household staff. She made decisions about food stores, ordering of goods, the care of guests, the distribution of clothing to the enslaved community. A shared rhythm. They moved together in the home, not always side by side, but never far apart. He would ride out in the mornings. She would tend to correspondence or manage the household schedule. Meals were taken at set times. Evenings often spent in the front parlor, where she might knit while he read. Words were few, but the comfort of routine filled the space where conversation might have lived. Her days began early, and her work was visible in the seamless rhythm of Mount Vernon's daily life. Not entangled, not climbing over each other, but shaped by the same winds. Their shared solitude was not loneliness. Martha preferred handwork. She had a fondness for embroidery, for mending, for knitting scarves and small comforts for grandchildren or visiting relatives. Her fingers moved with certainty, her face often expressionless, but calm. George, seated near her, might read from a favorite volume or simply sit, thinking. Occasionally, they would speak, but more often they shared a silence so familiar it became a kind of conversation. It was a kind of mutual withdrawal from the noise of the world outside. A way of preserving themselves in a life increasingly defined by others' expectations. She held the house together with her handwriting, her presence in the still room, her constant regard for detail. But when George returned, a different kind of rhythm resumed. They did not need to fill the silences. Theirs was a companionship built on parallel steadiness, like two oaks grown side by side. In the evenings, after the table had been cleared and the servants dismissed, they might sit near the hearth, each engaged in their own quiet labor. Martha preferred handwork. She had a fondness for embroidery, for mending, for knitting scarves, and small comforts for grandchildren or visiting relatives. Her fingers moved with certainty, her face often expressionless, but calm. A sense of deep understanding that needed no performance. In a world where most relationships were defined by duty or dominance, there seemed marked by a shared inwardness. She did not crave public life, but she endured it with the same composed grace she brought to Mount Vernon. For her small closet room where she kept her needlework. For the sound of the Potomac just beyond the trees. And George, too, felt that pull. But she remained watching over the house, ensuring its order. Two people who built a world not to impress, but to sustain. Who found, in the repetition of days and the hush of shared rooms, a kind of peace that rarely makes history books, but makes a life whole. She no longer entertained. Her world contracted, but she remained within it, surrounded by the memory of their shared rhythm. When she died 2 years later, it was not with fanfare, but with the same quiet dignity that had marked her life. She was buried beside him, their graves simple, solemn, side by side. Together, they counted the days until they could return. Not because they disliked the capital, but because Mount Vernon held the world they had made together, one of rhythm, of restraint, of shared quiet. Not speaking, not touching, just sitting, together. She held weekly receptions, what society called levees, where she stood for hours, welcoming guests, always in modest elegance. She wore silks, yes, but her manner remained simple. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered names. She never placed herself above anyone, though everyone placed her above most. She was not his shadow, and he was not her shelter. They were, in their own way, co-inhabitants of a solitude they had come to value. They rose early together, took breakfast without ceremony, sometimes sitting in the front room with the dogs nearby. They read scripture. They walked the grounds. Their children grown, their public roles complete, they returned fully to the domestic solitude that had always been their truest life. George, seated near her, might read from a favored volume or simply sit, thinking. Occasionally they would speak, but more often they shared a silence so familiar it became a kind of conversation. Visitors noted the stillness between them, not cold, but composed. When he became president, she joined him in New York, then Philadelphia. And yet, the public role never suited her. In private, she longed for home, for the garden paths. In later years, as age softened their steps and blurred the lines on their pages, their companionship deepened further. When George passed, Martha withdrew. She closed the room where he had died. She wore black for the rest of her days. She moved less, spoke even less. And so, in that resting place, as in their long years together, they remained not lovers in the storybook sense, but something more enduring companions in solitude. Even now, if one stands at the back of Mount Vernon at twilight, the chairs on the piazza empty, the river drifting slow and silent beyond the hill, you might imagine them there. Not every love story is loud. Some are just steady. As nightfall deepened over Mount Vernon, and the candles in the great house burned low, another world less seen, less spoken of, settled into its own fragile stillness. Beyond the trimmed gardens and formal parlor rooms, in the small cabins clustered near the fields and along the rear paths, the enslaved people who lived and labored at Mount Vernon ended their long days with quiet, exhausted rituals. It ended only when the light was gone, and even then, tasks lingered. But when they were finally released from the fields, the kitchens, the stables, the laundry houses, when the final call was made and the tools set aside, they walked back to their cabins in small groups, slow-footed, often quiet. The dirt paths beneath them bore the dust of countless repetitions. Each night the same, yet subtly different. The moon shifted its place in the sky. The air carried new scents, hay, smoke, fresh rain. And in that brief passage between labor and rest, there was space for breath. Their names, so many of them, have been lost to time or recorded only in ledgers, their stories obscured by the shadows of history. Yet every evening, as the estate softened into darkness, these men, women, and children returned to spaces not of comfort, but of temporary reprieve. And in that nighttime rhythm, brief, weary, but their own, there was a pulse of life, of community, and of silent strength that history too often passed over. Theirs was a life of hardship, yes, but also of endurance, of whispered songs, of hands clasped before sleep, of dreams no master could silence. The workday for most enslaved laborers began well before sunrise. The cabins were humble wooden, one-room structures with dirt floors and low ceilings. Inside, a hearth might flicker faintly, warming a corner of the room where a pot still held the last of a simple stew. The air smelled of smoke, of sweat, of the earth, a bench, a cot, blankets patched from scraps, perhaps a handmade doll resting beside a child already curled into sleep, perhaps a Bible, worn and passed from hand to hand. These spaces were not grand, but they were where the heart of the enslaved community beat most freely, quietly, carefully, but fully human. Evening was the only time they could speak freely, if only in hushed tones. Here, by firelight or starlight, they told stories. Old stories from Africa, passed down by voice alone. Tales of trickster spirits, of brave animals, of clever villagers who outwitted their oppressors. Stories that taught children to think, to hope, to endure. Sometimes songs floated out into the night. Lullabies, work songs slowed to a hum, or spirituals, melodies that spoke of sorrow, of escape, of rivers and freedom, and the promised land beyond this world. They did not sing loudly, but the sound carried all the same, threading through the trees like a prayer. Mothers sat with children in their laps, braiding hair, cleaning feet, whispering soft encouragements. Fathers, if they were permitted to stay with their families, might speak of the next day's work, of tools to repair, of planting seasons. Others sat alone, staring into embers, too tired to speak, their thoughts somewhere far off, remembering a homeland, perhaps, or imagining a future their children might see. Even silence was sacred in those hours. It was the only thing not owned by another. They laughed, too, sometimes. Quiet, quick laughter. A joke traded across the fire. A shared memory. A small delight in a stolen moment. These flashes of joy did not undo the hardship, but they defied it. Others in the mansion, in closer proximity to the Washington family. Still others were skilled laborers, blacksmiths, coopers, carpenters. Like Ona Judge, who would one day escape to freedom. like Billy Lee, Washington's personal attendant, who traveled with him through war and presidency alike. Their names survived. Many others did not, but all of them lived those evenings. All of them knew the quiet sounds of crickets outside the cabin, the creak of wood as someone turned in sleep, the cool touch of night air through a crack in the wall. They knew the ache of muscles overused, the flicker of memory, the stubborn beat of hope. Each night, regardless of role, they returned to this same dusk ritual, to water fetched from the well, to food prepared in haste, to garments mended by firelight. Their days belonged to others, but their nights, though short, were theirs. Each smile was a quiet act of resistance, a reminder that even in bondage, the human spirit reached for light. At Mount Vernon, over 300 enslaved people lived and worked in this system. Some worked in the fields. Among them were individuals like Hercules, the chef, known for his mastery in the kitchen. Like Ona Judge, who would one day escape to freedom. Like Billy Lee, Washington's personal attendant, who traveled with him through war and presidency alike. Their names survived. Many others did not, but all of them lived those evenings. All of them knew the quiet sounds of crickets outside the cabin, the creak of wood as someone turned in sleep, the cool touch of night air through a crack in the wall. They knew the ache of muscles overused, the flicker of memory, the stubborn beat of hope. Sometimes in winter, the fire died too soon, and the cold crept in. Sometimes in summer, the heat hung heavy, and the air felt thick and endless. He knew them as part of his estate. But knowing is not the same as understanding. But within it, they carved out life. The whisper of humanity that persisted in the hush after dusk, long after the world turned away. And while he walked Mount Vernon by daylight, with purpose and pride, the cabins remained apart from the mansion's symmetry. The silence between the worlds was wide. Children cried. The old coughed. The young dreamed. These nights were not easy, but they were real. They were lived, and they mattered. George Washington, to his credit, kept detailed records of those he enslaved, ledgers listing names, ages, family connections. And yet, the people who lived in those cabins built the place. Their hands raised the barns, grew the crops, washed the linens, cooked the food. Their evenings were spent nursing the wounds of the day, not only physical, but spiritual. And still, they endured. For something they could not name, but longed for just the same. Others simply lay down, letting their breath slow, their bodies surrender to the small peace that sleep might offer, however brief. Some prayed alone or together, quiet voices speaking into the dark, for strength, for deliverance. Their dreams were their own. And in the archaeology of Mount Vernon, if one listens closely, one can still hear the echo of their presence. Not in monuments or titles, but in the worn stone steps, in the footprints on old thresholds, in the stories passed down through generations. The night held them, and still holds them, even if the pages of history once looked the other way. Their solitude was not chosen. And tonight, as we remember them, not in pain, but in quiet witness, we honor the depth of that life, the softness of that resistance, the whisper of humanity that persisted in the hush after dusk, long after the world turned away. It was not uncommon, in the years before and after the Revolution, for travelers to find themselves at Mount Vernon as the light faded and the roads darkened. Some arrived by carriage, wheels groaning over rutted paths, horses damp with exertion. A servant, often already waiting by the front portico, would step forward to take a coat or guide a carriage to the stables. Luggage was lifted, damp cloaks removed, hands offered to help dismount. The air at dusk was often cool, even in summer, and the scent of the nearby river mingled with that of boxwood and distant smoke. Once inside, the guests were not overwhelmed with ceremony. Instead, there was a soft order to it all, a quiet procession into the central hall, a polite greeting, A nod from the master of the house, who rarely offered grand displays, but who carried his welcome in posture and tone. Others came by boat, their silhouettes rising from the mist of the Potomac, as sails were furled and oars pulled quietly through the shallows. His hospitality was rooted not in extravagance, but in respect. He ensured that rooms were ready, fires lit, beds turned down, meals timely. Conversation at dinner might drift from agriculture to statecraft, from recollections of battles to reflections on weather and crops. If the guest was younger or unknown, he would listen more than speak. If the guest was esteemed, he would ask thoughtful questions. And when the meal ended and the table cleared, there would often be tea in the drawing room, Martha nearby, embroidery in her lap, her presence warm, her words gentle. They came with letters of introduction, or with none at all. Officers, diplomats, old friends, distant cousins, passing strangers. Some expected only a warm meal and a place to rest their heads. Others sought conversation, counsel, or simply the experience of standing where Washington stood. And as the sun slipped behind the trees and lamps were lit in the windows, the house prepared once again to receive them. For Mount Vernon, though private in rhythm, was never fully closed. It was a home, yes, but also a hearthstone for a young and curious country, a place where the night was shared. The arrivals were met with practiced ease. George Washington was not effusive, but he was attentive. He received visitors with the same gravity he brought to letters or public statements, deliberate, calm, and always observing. His hospitality was rooted not in extravagance, but in respect. He ensured that rooms were ready, fires lit, beds turned down, meals timely. Others brought requests, patents to be signed, opinions to be weighed, favors to be asked. But many brought only curiosity. What did Washington think of the Constitution? Of the French Revolution? Of the future of the West? And though he answered, he often did so with brevity. And many would remember their time at Mount Vernon as something set apart, not merely a visit, but a pause. A moment when they stepped into a place not governed by urgency, but by rhythm. Where history was not declared, but lived quietly in the patterns of a house that breathed with discipline and care. He left space for others to speak, and when the hour grew late, he would rise with quiet finality, offer a small bow or gesture, and retreat to his chamber, his role as host fulfilled with neither flourish nor fatigue. Conversation at dinner might drift from agriculture to statecraft, from recollections of battles to reflections on weather and crops. Upstairs, the floors creaked gently beneath their steps. Oil lamps flickered in the hallways, casting long golden shadows against the paneled walls. Each guest room bore the scent of lavender or fresh linens, placed by the housemaids earlier in the day. The bedding was firm but warm, the fireplaces modest but tended. A small basin of water might wait beside the washstand. A folded towel, a Bible placed neatly nearby. If the guest was younger or unknown, he would listen more than speak. If the guest was esteemed, he would ask thoughtful questions. And when the meal ended and the table cleared, there would often be tea in the drawing room. Martha nearby, embroidery in her lap, her presence warm, her words gentle. Some guests brought news from afar, stories from the capital, from France, from distant plantations. For the guests, their chambers had already been prepared. And once the doors were closed, the house settled around them like a breath held in peace. From their beds, guests could hear the quiet rhythm of the estate wind against the shutters, the rustle of leaves, the muffled sounds of horses in the distance. If they rose early enough, they might glimpse Washington walking his grounds at dawn, alone and deep in thought. If they lingered longer, they would meet him again at breakfast, seated already, tea in hand, nodding a welcome with the same composed warmth he offered to kings and colonels alike. Some guests stayed one night, others several. Some returned again years later, older, changed. And many would remember their time at Mount Vernon as something set apart, not merely a visit, but a pause. A moment when they stepped into a place not governed by urgency, but by rhythm. Their names appear only briefly in Washington's journals. A gentleman from Williamsburg, or Major Lewis called with his wife. And yet their presence mattered, for each visitor became part of the house's memory. Each left behind a breath, a word, a footprint pressed faintly into the floorboards. Their labor made the comfort of guests seamless. And though their names were rarely recorded alongside those of the visitors, their presence filled every hallway, their footsteps just as much a part of the rhythm of the night, not just of the body, but of the mind, for guests, for silence, for memory, for time. It offered them the quiet company of a man who understood the power of steadiness. A man who, even in his solitude, made room for others. Where history was not declared, but lived quietly in the patterns of a house that breathed with discipline and care. There were elderly veterans who shared old stories by the fire. There were French dignitaries, uncomfortable in rustic chairs, but charmed by the candor of the household. There were grandchildren, cousins, family friends, some expected, others not. And always, Mount Vernon opened its doors. They remembered the quiet dignity of their host, the steady presence of the house, the softness of the air in the morning, the way the Potomac caught the sun. And for a brief moment, they felt the stillness that Washington had so carefully built into every wall, every walkway, every room. Not all guests were notable. Some have faded from record entirely. In the old Virginian ethic that a home must extend itself to those in need of rest. And so the rooms were cleaned, the beds remade, the logs stacked higher, and another candle placed in the window to guide a carriage in the night. There were young officers, still smelling of saddle leather, who came seeking guidance. Washington rarely turned people away. He believed in courtesy. Of course, the enslaved staff made this possible. It was they who prepared the meals, who stirred the fires, who laundered the linens and polished the silver. For the guests, the experience of staying at Mount Vernon lingered long after departure. And so, night after night, year after year, the house received them people of many voices, many stories. And in return, it offered them rest. And perhaps that is what Mount Vernon was, above all a house that held space. For guests, for silence, for memory, for time. Even in a life so meticulously documented, so carefully curated in memory and marble, there remains a vast and silent space surrounding George Washington. A space that no journal enters, no portrait illuminates, no document defines. It is the inner landscape of a man who mastered the art of silence, who lived beneath the weight of great expectation, and who, despite the public hunger to understand him, held part of himself gently back. There are facts, yes, the battles fought, the letters written, the land surveyed, the words spoken in halls where laws were born. But there is also the quiet that surrounded those facts, the thoughts he never penned, the fears he never voiced, the memories he never named. And it is there, in that soft, unwritten space, that we find the edges of mystery. Not the kind that troubles, but the kind that comforts. The gentle truth that even in a figure so known, so studied, there are places we will never enter, and perhaps should never try to. What did he think about in the final moments before sleep? Not just on his last night, but on all the ordinary nights that came before. Those dusky evenings after the fire had dimmed and the house had quieted. But surely he dreamed of places he had never been, of moments he wished had gone differently, of people who had passed through his life like ships in the fog, leaving only ripples behind. Perhaps there were faces he thought of often, but never named aloud. People who influenced him, inspired him, or hurt him, those whose presence left a deeper mark than words could carry. When his boots were placed neatly aside, and the dogs had settled on the floor nearby, did he remember old friends? Did he think of battles, the ones won and the ones merely survived? Did he picture his mother's voice, long since faded into the background of time? Or did his mind drift to silence, not a thoughtless silence, but a kind of peace, a suspension of needing to know or decide anything more? He rarely wrote about dreams. He was not a man of florid imagination, at least not publicly. But surely Washington dreamed of places he had never been, of moments he wished had gone differently, of people who had passed through his life like ships in the fog, leaving only ripples behind. Perhaps there were faces he thought of often, but never named aloud. People who influenced him, inspired him, or hurt him, those whose presence left a deeper mark than words could carry. We know he mourned, but we do not know how. When a comrade fell, when a family member died, when a servant passed quietly into memory, how did that sorrow unfold within him? Revered by a nation, yes, but rarely fully known. Did he find the adulation isolating? Whether he counted rows of corn in his mind, or simply watched the breeze play over the grasses. Whether his inner voice was gentle or firm, encouraging or cautious. Whether he recited scripture silently to calm his thoughts, or counted the seasons as they passed across the hills beyond his study. Whether he felt contentment or yearning. Whether he believed he had done enough, or wondered if he had missed something essential in the pursuit of what was expected. We see fragments, the satisfaction of a successful harvest, the pleasure of a well-kept horse, the smile shared with a child. But what lifted him, truly? What made him laugh when no one else was watching? Did he ever dance, even a little, even alone? Did he ever walk faster just because the wind called him forward? Whether he ever sat at the edge of a gathering, listening to a violin or a hymn, and felt a pang too deep for language. We do not know what scent took him most powerfully back in time, whether the damp smell of earth reminded him of his childhood walks, or the sweet perfume of wood smoke brought to mind cold nights in tents lit only by hope. Did he sometimes long to shed the role and simply be George, the man, not the symbol? His letters bear the etiquette of loss, the formula of condolence. But between those lines, was there a moment when he sat alone, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing, letting the weight settle into him before moving again through the motions of duty? Illness, perhaps, disorder, disappointment, not of others, but of himself. He held himself to quiet standards, invisible but unyielding. And when he failed, as all men do, he carried that failure inward. We see glimpses of apologies worded carefully, regrets hinted at, but the full burden he bore alone. Did Washington ever feel lonely, truly? Surrounded by people nearly always, by advisors, soldiers, family, visitors, staff, yet often apart from them. We cannot know the shape of his thoughts when he looked out across his fields at dusk. There is no letter that tells us what he feared most. We do not know what music stirred him, if any. We do not know how he spoke to himself when no one else could hear. Even his moments of joy real. Human joy are hard to pin down. We see fragments, the satisfaction of a successful harvest, the pleasure of a well-kept horse, the smile shared with a child. But what lifted him, truly? What made George Washington laugh when no one else was watching? Did he ever dance, even a little, even alone? Did he ever walk faster just because the wind called him forward? Because it reminds us that even the most visible lives have corners of privacy. That even great men were men first. Yes, but we are also walking near silence. The same silence he carried into sleep each night, the same silence he shared with Martha, the same silence that followed him through every office, every battlefield, every quiet morning in the study. That the truest parts of us are not always written down. To breathe slowly beside the unknown. To let the stillness speak, as he once did, his words. And the long breath of history exhales into the hush of night. We bring our footsteps to a pause. Of tea cooling beside a half-written letter. Of hands that brushed over folded linen, and minds that wandered in the last dim minutes before sleep. Who does not sometimes long for quiet, not as an escape, but as a way of returning to something simple, rooted, whole? In George's silence, we find not coldness, but care, not absence, but intention. And in the shape of his stillness, we are gently reminded that a life does not have to be allowed to be full. That leadership can be steady. That dignity can be quiet. That history is not always thunder. It is sometimes the soft turning of a page at the end of the day. He was not always the marble figure gazing down from pedestals. George Washington was, more often, a man who fed the horses before dusk, who walked the worn path to the back fields, who paused at the window with a thought he never told anyone. And it is in these details, not the battles, not the oaths, but the human rituals of dusk and reflection, that we remember him most truthfully. Not because we know all that he was, but because in the spaces where the record falls silent, we recognize something of ourselves. We have walked slowly through his world, through shadows and firelight, through journals and war-torn dreams, through the tender mysteries of private rooms and the heavy velvet of unsent letters. We've stepped softly behind the doors that never fully open, and stood beside the man behind the monument, not to intrude, but to gently wonder. In the stillness of these hours, we have not sought to explain him, but to feel his presence as one might feel the wind off the Potomac, cool, constant, and quietly carrying something older than language. Something that speaks only to those willing to listen in silence. His actions. But we cannot know the full heart behind them, and that is not a flaw in the record. It is a truth of being human. There are rooms in his heart we will never enter, not because they are locked, but because they were never meant to be preserved. Some things he chose not to share, not out of secrecy, but out of reverence. The quiet dignity of holding something close, not for history's gaze, but for the soul's safekeeping. And in that not knowing, there is a strange comfort. So when we look at Mount Vernon now, at the walls he built, the books he read, the gardens he shaped, we are walking among symbols. We can know his schedule. Because every life, no matter how grand or humble, holds its own quiet mysteries. And perhaps the greatest honor we can give George Washington now is not to try and solve them, but simply to sit with him, to feel the quiet, and let it be enough. And now, dear listener, as the last candle flickers low in the quiet corridors of Mount Vernon, George Washington's life, for all its magnitude and public weight, was also made of small evenings, of wooden floorboards creaking under slippers. For who among us does not carry things unspoken? Who does not hold private hopes folded between public duties, or feel the weight of a decision long after it has passed? Who does not sometimes long for quiet, not as an escape, but as a way of returning to something simple, rooted, whole? In George's silence, we find not coldness, but care, not absence, but intention. And in the shape of his stillness, we are gently reminded that a life does not have to be allowed to be full. That leadership can be steady. That dignity can be quiet. That history is not always thunder. It is sometimes the soft turning of a page at the end of the day. Perhaps tonight, as you lay in your own bed, hearing the distant hush of wind against your window, or the warm creak of the walls that hold your world together, you can let your own thoughts drift into that same softness. You do not have to solve everything. You do not have to be known entirely. You only have to rest. There is peace in letting the weight fall off your shoulders for a while. Let it be enough that you are here. Let it be enough that you have listened. Let it be enough that you breathe, slowly, calmly, now. We leave behind the echo of footsteps on Mount Vernon stairs, the scent of old books, the glow of a hearth long cold. We leave behind the uniform folded with care, the chair pushed back from a desk lined with memory. If your mind is still restless, you may return to the beginning. Not for the headlines, but for the histories whispered under stars. There is always another story waiting not to be solved, but to be settled into, like a soft bed at the end of a long day. or close your eyes and let the story dissolve into your dreams. And if you found comfort here, if the silence felt kind, and the pacing felt patient, know that we share more nights like this, more histories told not to awaken, but to ease. We leave behind the figure in profile, and remember instead the soft reality, the man who once closed his eyes to sleep, as you now will. We are not so far from him after all. Time is long, but the rhythms of human rest are always the same. In the end, we all retreat to the quiet. Thank you, gentle traveler, for joining us in this walk through twilight. You're warmly invited to subscribe to Echo, not for the noise, but for the hush. For now, let the night hold you. Let the past drift gently away, and may sleep, like the Potomac's slow waters, carry you home. Good night, Echo.